Dark fantasy is one of the most misunderstood corners of the genre. People often assume it just means more blood, more grief, and a grimmer mood. But that misses the real contract at the heart of it. Today, let's break down how dark fantasy actually works, and how to write it well. First, understand that dark fantasy is a spectrum, not a single point. At one end, you have fantasy that simply refuses to soften its subject matter while keeping a broadly heroic shape. Move further in, and you reach grimdark, where nihilism and moral bleakness sit close to the center. Push further still, and you find the fantasy horror hybrid, where dread and body horror take over, and the fantastical exists mainly to serve fear. At the far edge sits weird fantasy, where the cosmic and the incomprehensible replace recognizable moral stakes altogether. So what holds this whole spectrum together? It isn't body count, and it isn't a grim tone for its own sake. It's that hope, if it exists at all, has to be earned. The world offers no guarantee of decency, order, or rescue. That's the promise readers are really chasing. They want honesty about power and its true cost. They want a refusal to look away from what a fantasy world's usual machinery would actually do to the people living inside it. Think of magic, monarchy, monsters, and chosen ones, and what those things would really cost. Dark fantasy readers aren't hunting despair. They want the sensation that nothing was softened for their comfort. They want to feel that whatever good survives, the story earned its survival honestly. That's why the genre tolerates violence, moral compromise, and grief that doesn't resolve. The darkness isn't nihilism. It's a refusal to cheat the reader with easy comfort. Now let's look at the hallmarks that define the genre. The first is the world that doesn't care. The setting, the gods, or the systems of power are indifferent to suffering, rather than actively evil. That indifference unsettles a reader far more than a villain with a plan. The second is the corrupted cost of power. Magic, blood, sanity, or years of life are extracted as a genuine price, not decoration. The third is the morally compromised protagonist. This is a character the reader roots for despite, or because of, choices that would make them the villain in a brighter book. The fourth is the atrocity witnessed plainly. Violence is rendered with weight and consequence, so it registers as loss rather than spectacle. And the fifth is the hard-won grace note. A small act of decency or connection survives the bleakness without erasing it. Consider Joe Abercrombie's First Law World. Glocta's torture chamber scenes work because the prose refuses to look away. The horror is structural, not decorative. These hallmarks branch into distinct subgenres worth knowing. There's grimdark, where moral bleakness moves to the center. There's gothic fantasy, carried by dread, decay, and the uncanny. There's the fantasy horror hybrid, where fear dominates over wonder. There's dark sword and sorcery, with low reward for virtue. There's weird fantasy, bordering on Lovecraftian horror. There's villain protagonist fantasy, where the point of view character is the monster. And there's low fantasy brutal realism, where stakes are small, magic is scarce, and violence is unglamorous. Once you know the flavor, you need to know how these stories tend to move. The most common shape is the descent. A protagonist drifts steadily further from where the story found them, with no guaranteed floor. Another is the bargain that costs more than promised. A deal solves an immediate problem while creating a worse one later. Then there's survival against indifference, where the antagonist is a world or a force, not a person. There's complicity discovered, where a protagonist realizes their own hands are dirtier than they believed. And there's the Pyrrhic victory, where the goal is achieved, but the cost makes you question whether it was worth it. Character arcs follow the same logic. Incremental corruption normalizes small compromises until the character can't locate the line they crossed. Grace under no guarantee tests whether decency can survive contact with real cost. The monster examined gives a repellent character enough interiority that we must sit with understanding, not simple condemnation. And hope rationed tracks how much optimism, if any, is left by the end. It also helps to know where dark fantasy blends and where it fights. Horror is a natural partner, since dread and body horror transfer directly. General fantasy works too, because dark fantasy is really a tonal position on the same spectrum. Literary fiction shares the refusal of tidy resolution, and historical fiction lends the instinct that the past was never safer. But there are genres it resists. Epic fantasy's restoration arc, where order is re-established by the end, runs against dark fantasy's comfort with unresolved outcomes. So a hybrid has to decide early which promise governs the ending. Romance's guaranteed happy ending can conflict with grief that doesn't resolve. And YA fantasy's expectation of a hopeful floor sits uneasily against dark fantasy's willingness to remove that floor entirely. So how do you begin a story like this? Establish the world's indifference early, through a detail, not a lecture. Introduce cost before payoff, so power's price is visible before its benefit. Ground the reader in a stake they can actually feel, or the darkness reads as posturing. Signal moral complexity without resolving it, so compromise appears early rather than as a late twist. And commit to tone immediately, because each flavor promises a different floor of hope. Watch out for the most common pitfall: darkness as decoration, where grim events happen without weight or consequence. A reader can always tell the difference between a story that is dark and a story that is merely performing darkness. Here's a quick exercise to close. Take your protagonist's relationship to hope. What is the last piece of decency or belief they still hold as the story opens? What single event would cost them that belief? And do you know yet whether it happens? Answer those questions honestly, and you'll be writing dark fantasy that earns its darkness.